The ship was cold and white, and it hummed with a sound that David Park could feel in his bones. He stood in the center of a large round room with no windows and no doors that he could see. The walls seemed to glow with their own light, and strange. Symbols floated in the air around him like ghosts made of blue fire. 12 different creatures stood in a circle around him. Some were tall and thin like glass statues that caught the light and broke it into rainbows. Some were covered in scales that changed color every few seconds. Some had too many eyes or too many arms or bodies that bent in ways that made his head hurt to look at. David was a soldier. He had been a soldier for 15 years. He had seen combat in 3 different wars. He had been captured once and held for 217 days in a hole in the ground. He had survived things that should have killed him many times over, but he had never seen anything like this, a creature that looked like a snake made of liquid metal slithered forward. Its scales shifted from green to blue to purple as it moved, and when it spoke, the words appeared in David's mind like thoughts that were not his own. "You are the human called David Park," it said. "You have been selected for evaluation." David did not answer. He had learned long ago that silence was a weapon, and he was very good at using it. The snake creature tilted its head in a way that seemed almost human. "We are the Galactic Coalition," it continued. "We have watched your world for many of your centuries. We have studied your species and recorded your development. You are entry 743 in our catalog of intelligent life." David still said nothing, but he filed away that number. 742 other species had come before humanity. That was a lot of competition. The creature who called itself Ambassador Thelvan gestured with one of its many limbs, and the blue symbols in the air rearranged themselves into shapes that David recognized, charts and graphs and numbers that measured things he could not understand. "We will test you," it said. "We will measure your speed and your strength and your mind. We have done this with all species. It is how we determine where each species belongs in the order of things. Where they belong." David repeated, speaking for the first time. Thelvan made a sound that might have been surprise. "Yes, the strong species lead. The weak species follow. The average species simply exist. It is the natural way." David looked around the room at all the different creatures watching him with their strange eyes. Some looked bored. Some looked curious. One or two looked almost hungry. "And what do you expect from humans?" he asked. Thelvan made another sound. And this time David was certain it was laughter. "We expect very little," it said. "Your species is young and violent and emotional. You have not yet left your own solar system. You fight wars among yourselves over patches of dirt and ideas that exist only in your minds. You are." He paused, searching for the right word. Unremarkable. David felt something stir in his chest. Something hot and old and dangerous. He had felt it before in the moments before battle, in the darkness of that hole in the ground, when he had decided that he would not die there, no matter what. But he kept his face still and his voice calm. "Then let's begin," he said. The first test was simple. Lights would flash from different directions, and he had to track them with his eyes. The creatures watching him seemed almost bored as they explained the rules. They expected him to catch maybe 60% of the flashes. That was the average for species at humanity's level of development. David caught 94%. The room went very quiet. "Run it again," Thelvan ordered, and David could hear something new in the voice that appeared in his mind. Confusion maybe, or the beginning of fear. They ran again. David caught 96%. The tall glass creatures began to whisper among themselves in sounds that were too high for human ears to hear. At least that was what they thought. But David heard them. His hearing had always been good, and it had gotten better after the accident that killed his squad, after he spent 3 days buried under rubble, listening to his own heartbeat and promising himself that he would survive. They were saying words like anomaly and impossible and genetic outlier. David smiled, but only on the inside. The next test measured his endurance. They put him on a machine that was like a treadmill, but harder, and they told him to run. They expected him to last maybe 2 hours. 3 at most. David ran for 11 hours. He could have kept going. His body had found that place it went sometimes where pain became just another sensation like heat or cold. His lungs burned and his legs screamed, but he had felt worse. He had survived worse. They stopped the test because their equipment was overheating, not because he was slowing down. Thelvan watched him step off the machine, barely breathing hard, and the ambassador's scales had turned a color David had not seen before, a dark orange that pulsed like a warning light. The third test measured his pain tolerance. They attached sensors to his skin and sent electrical signals through his body. Each pulse was stronger than the last. They told him that most species tapped out at level 15. The strongest warriors they had ever tested reached level 23. David laughed at level 30. It was not a happy laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had learned what real pain felt like. A man who had been broken and put himself back together so many times that the breaking did not scare him anymore. The creatures watching him were no longer bored. Some of them had backed away from the observation windows. Others were talking rapidly in languages that sounded like music or static or thunder. The fourth test was a puzzle. They put him in a room with no visible exit and told him to find his way out. The previous record was held by something called the Zithari hive mind, a species that shared one brain between millions of bodies. They had escaped in 19 minutes. David escaped in 4. It was not that the puzzle was easy. It was that he had spent his whole life solving puzzles like this. How to survive when survival seemed impossible. How to find hope in hopeless places. How to keep moving forward when every part of you wanted to stop. When he walked back into the main chamber, Thelvan was waiting for him. The ambassador was alone now. The other creatures had left, and David could guess why. They were afraid. You are not what we expected, Thelvan said. David looked at the creature that had called humanity unremarkable, that had spoken of putting his species in its proper place in some cosmic order. No, he said, I am exactly what you should have expected. You just were not paying attention. Thelvan made a sound that David could not interpret. What do you mean? David stepped closer, and he saw the ambassador flinch back just slightly. You watched us for centuries, he said. You saw our wars and our violence and our emotions, and you thought those things made us weak. He shook his head. Those things are why we are strong. We fight because we refuse to surrender. We feel because we refuse to be numb. We keep going because we refuse to accept that anything is impossible. He was close enough now to see his own reflection in Thelvan's shifting scales, a small figure surrounded by strangeness, but somehow not small at all. You have tested 412 species, he said, and his voice was quiet, but it filled the room. You have measured them and ranked them and put them in their proper places. He smiled, and this time he let it show on his face. But you have never tested anything like us. The tests continued for 6 more days, and each day brought new surprises for the creatures who watched David Park. They had expected to find the limits of human ability. They had expected to reach a point where he would fail like all the others had failed. They never found that point. On the second day, they tested his memory. They showed him thousands of images for less than a second each and asked him to recall them. He remembered 87%. The scientists made notes and whispered to each other, and David could see the worry growing in their strange eyes. On the third day, they tested his problem solving again, this time with puzzles that were supposed to be impossible. Puzzles designed by species that have been solving problems for millions of years before humanity learned to walk upright. David did not solve all of them, but he solved enough to make the room go silent. On the fourth day, they tested his ability to function without sleep. They kept him awake for 72 hours and then asked him to perform complex tasks. He made mistakes, but fewer than they expected. Far fewer than any species at his level of development should have made. How is this possible? One of the glass creatures asked. It was talking to Thelvan. But David heard it clearly. Humans sleep for 1/3 of their lives. Their brains should not function at this level of deprivation. Thelvan had no answer. His scales had been stuck on that dark orange color for days now. On the 5th day they tested his healing. They made small cuts on his arm with his permission and measured how fast the wounds closed. The results made them bring in more scientists, who ran more tests and spoke in voices that David could tell were frightened even though he did not understand the words. On the 6th day they ran out of tests. David sat in the small room they had given him. It was comfortable enough with a bed that adjusted to his body and food that tasted strange but filled his stomach. He'd been treated, well, all things considered, better than his last captors had treated him, but he was still a prisoner. He knew that, and he was tired of waiting. The door opened, and Thelvan slithered inside, followed by someone new. This creature was huge, easily 8 feet tall, with a body covered in what looked like natural armor. Plates of dark shell overlapped across its chest and arms and legs. Its head was something like an insect's, with large dark eyes and mandibles that clicked when it moved. David stood. Slowly he recognized a predator when he saw one. "This is High Commander Morvax," Thelvan said. The ambassador seemed nervous, his scales flickering through colors too. Fast to follow. He is the leader of the Drakathi warrior caste. He is requested to meet you. Massive creature called Morvax stepped forward, and David had to tilt his head back to look at its face. "I am told you are exceptional," Morvax said. Its voice was deep like stones grinding together. "I do not believe it." David said nothing. He was watching the way Morvax moved, the way its weight shifted from foot to foot. This was a fighter, someone who had killed before and would kill again without hesitation. "Humans." Soft Morvax continued. "You have no claws, no armor, no venom. You cannot survive in vacuum or extreme temperatures. You are fragile." David met those dark insect eyes. "We did not need those things." Morvax made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Bold words, little creature. Let us see if you can support them with action." Before Thelvan could speak, Morvax raised one massive arm. Something in its palm began to glow, a bright angry orange that grew brighter with each heartbeat. David knew what was coming. He had seen weapons like this before, in the war that had almost killed him. The enemy had used plasma grenades, concentrated balls of superheated energy that could burn through anything. Morvax was going to shoot him. The room erupted in chaos. Thelvan was screaming something in a language David did not understand. The glass creatures scattered their bodies, chiming like bells as they fled. Scientists dove behind equipment and walls and anything that might protect them, but David did not move. He watched the plasma bolt form in Morvax's palm. He watched it grow brighter and hotter until it hurt to look at. He watched the moment when it launched toward him, trailing fire like a tiny sun. Time slowed down. This had happened to David before, in moments of extreme danger, when death was close enough to touch something, and his brain would shift. Everything would become clear and slow, and he could see things that should have been too fast to see. Doctors back home had never been able to explain it. They called it an anomaly, a quirk of his nervous system that should not be possible. David called it a gift. He watched the bolt come toward him. He calculated its speed and trajectory. He felt his body responding, muscles coiling, heart rate dropping, breath steadying, and then he reached out and caught it. The plasma burned into his palm instantly. The pain was extraordinary, beyond anything the tests had measured, beyond anything he had felt since the grenade that had killed his squad 15 years ago. But he held it. His skin blackened and cracked. His flesh burned away layer by layer. He could smell himself cooking, and some distant part of his mind noted that it smelled like pork, but he did not let go. Morvax stood frozen. Those dark eyes were wide, now wider than they should have been able to go. The mandibles had stopped clicking. The whole room had stopped. Everything. David looked at the creature that had tried to kill him. He looked at the ambassador, who had called humanity unremarkable. He looked at all the scientists and observers who'd spent a week measuring him and testing him and trying to understand what he was. Earthborn, he said. His voice was steady, even though his hand was being destroyed, even though the agony was so intense that his vision was starting to go white at the edges. Then he closed his fist and crushed the bolt. The plasma hissed and sparked and died. The light faded, the heat dissipated, and David was left standing in the silence, holding the ruin of his own hand. Looked at Morvaxis, that exceptional enough for youth. Jokathi Commander did not answer. Could not answer, David realized. He was staring at the human in front of him with something that looked almost like religious. Awethovan was the first to move. The ambassador rushed forward, calling for medics, for doctors, for anyone who could help. But David noticed that even as Thelvan shouted orders, his scales had changed color again. They were white now, pure white, like snow, like surrender. You caught it, one of the glass creatures whispered. You caught a plasma bolt in your bare hand. That is not possible. David finally let himself feel the pain. He finally let himself acknowledge that he had just done something that should have killed him. His legs buckled and he dropped to his knees, but he was smiling. Maybe not for you, he said. Maybe not for any species you have ever tested. But for humans, he looked up at them, all these strange creatures from strange worlds. Who had thought they understood the universe? For humans, impossible is just a word. Morvax knelt down, bringing those massive insect eyes level with David's face. What are you? The Jokathi asked, and his voice was different now. Softer, almost afraid. What are you really? David thought about his answer. He thought about the grenade that had killed his friends and left him dying in the dirt. He thought about the 3 days he had spent buried alive, listening to his own heartbeat. He thought about coming back from death with something new inside him, something that refused to quit no matter what we are. What happens when a planet tries to kill everything on it for 4 billion years? He said. We are what survives. He looked at his ruined hand, already feeling the strange tingling that meant it was starting to heal, already knowing that the scientists would have new questions and new tests and new fears. We are Earthborn, he said. And you have no idea what that means. But you will. Grace Kim had been a scientist for 20 years. She had studied biology and genetics and evolution. She had written papers that changed how people thought about life itself. She had won awards and given lectures and trained the next generation of researchers. But nothing in her career had prepared her for this. She stood in the medical bay of the Coalition ship, staring at the readouts on screens. She barely understood and trying to make sense of what she was seeing. David Park lay on the examination table. His hand, the one that had caught a ball of superheated plasma 3 days ago, was almost completely healed. New skin, pink and fresh, covered what had been burned bone and ash. The doctor said it should have taken months if it healed at all. But here it was whole and functional and impossible. That should have killed you, Grace, said. David opened his eyes. He looked tired, but there was something bright in his gaze, something that had been there since the day she met him, something that refused to go out. I know, he said. It almost did once before. Grace pulled up his file on a display. She had access now. Full access. The Coalition had given it to her after David's demonstration. They wanted her to explain. She was supposed to be the expert on human biology, but the more she read, the less she understood. You died, she said, reading the report from 15 years ago. Your heart stopped for 7 minutes after a plasma grenade detonated next to you. The medics recorded you as deceased. They were preparing to bag your body when you started breathing again. David sat up, slowly testing his new hand, opening and closing his fingers. It hurt, but it worked. It would be fine. I remember, he said. I remember being dead. I remember a darkness that went on forever. And I remember deciding that I was not finished, that I had more to do. He looked at her, and Grace felt a chill run down her spine. So I came back. The door opened, and Thelvan entered, followed by a group of creatures Grace had never seen before. They were smaller than most of the Coalition species, with large eyes and delicate hands and bodies that seemed to be made of living light. "These are the archives," Thelvan said. His scales were a steady blue, now calm but watchful. "They are the keepers of all Coalition knowledge. They have been studying your species since David demonstrated his abilities." One of the archives stepped forward and waved its glowing hand. The air filled with images. "We believed humans were primitive," the archive said. Its voice was like music, soft and high and beautiful. "We believed this because your technology was primitive. Compared to Coalition standards, you had barely begun to explore the universe." The images showed human cities, human vehicles, human weapons, all of them simple and crude next to the gleaming ships and devices of the Coalition. "So, we dismissed you," the archive continued. "We cataloged you as entry 743. Average intelligence, average physical capability. No special adaptations, no unique traits." The images changed. Now they showed something else: a woman lifting a car. Her child was trapped underneath, and she lifted a vehicle that weighed 2,000 pounds. With her bare hands, a man walking through a desert. He had been lost for 10 days without water. His body should have shut down after 3, but he kept walking until he found help. A soldier fighting in a war. Half of her face had been burned away by an explosion, but she kept firing her weapon, kept protecting her squad, kept going until the battle was won. "We were wrong," the archive said. "We were looking at the wrong things." Grace stared at the images. She knew these stories. Everyone on Earth knew them. They were famous examples of human endurance. Human refusal to give up. But seeing them here displayed by alien beings as evidence of something extraordinary made them feel different. "What are you saying?" Grace asked. Thelvan slithered closer. His scales shifted to that dark orange color. Again, the one that meant uncertainty. "We have studied 412 species," he said. "We have cataloged their abilities, their limits, their potential. Each species has a breaking point, a moment when their bodies and minds can no longer continue." He looked at David, who was watching silently from the examination table. "Humans do not seem to have this breaking point." The archive waved its hand again, and new images appeared: medical scans, brain activity charts, genetic analyses. "Your bodies produce chemicals in moments of extreme stress," it explained. "Adrenaline, cortisol, others we do not have names for. These chemicals allow you to temporarily exceed your normal physical limits." Grace nodded. She knew this. It was basic human biology, but you do not understand what this means, the archive said. "Among all species we have studied, humans are the only ones who can do this. The only ones whose bodies have evolved a mechanism to override their own limitations." The images changed again. Now they showed Earth from space. It looked beautiful, blue and green and white, swirling with clouds and light. "Your planet," the archive said, "is a death world." Grace felt her breath catch. What the images zoomed in, showing earthquakes and volcanoes and tsunamis, showing ice ages that covered continents and asteroid impacts that blacked out the sun, showing plagues and famines and extinctions that wiped out 90% of all life. "For 4 billion years, the archive said, your world has tried to kill everything on it. The conditions on Earth are more extreme than 98% of all inhabited planets. Temperatures that swing from burning to freezing. Predators that hunt in every environment. Diseases that mutate faster than any we have seen elsewhere. Natural disasters that reshape the land without warning." Grace had never thought of Earth that way. To her, it was just home, familiar and normal and safe. "But it is not safe," the archive said, reading her expression. "Nothing on your world is safe, and that is why you are what you are." David spoke for the first time. "Your species evolved in stable environments," he said, slowly working through the idea. "You developed technology to overcome challenges. We developed ourselves." Thelvan nodded, his scales shifting to a color Grace had not seen before, something between fear and respect. "You are not exceptional because of what you can do," he said. "You are exceptional because of what you refuse to accept." Grace thought about every story she had ever heard about human survival, About people who should have died but did not, about impossible recoveries and unbelievable endurance, about the stubborn refusal to give up that seemed to be written into human DNA. We always thought it was normal. She whispered. Is not normal, the archive said. It is unique. It is unprecedented. It is the creature paused, searching for the right word. Terrifying. David stood up from the examination table. His hand was fully healed, now, not even a scar to show where the plasma had burned through. Good, he said. The aliens all turned to look at him. Good, the David repeated, because we have a lot more to show you. The news spread across the galaxy like fire through dry grass. The humans were not what anyone expected. They were not primitive. They were not weak. They were not unremarkable. They were something else entirely, something that made the oldest and strongest species in the coalition nervous. Within weeks, ships began arriving at the station where David was being held, not to threaten, not to attack, just to see, to observe, to try to understand. Colonel James Lee arrived first. He was a pilot, one of the best Earth had ever produced. He had flown experimental aircraft that moved faster than sound, faster than anything should be able to move with a living creature inside. The G-forces he had survived would have liquefied the internal organs of any other species. But James just called it part of the job. Then came Dr. Hannah Park. No relation to David, despite the shared name. She was a physicist who specialized in spatial mechanics. She could look at a problem involving movement and distance and time, and somehow just know the answer before she finished the calculations. Her colleagues back home called it intuition. The coalition scientists called it something closer to magic. Then came Sergeant Michael Cho. He had lost both legs in combat, blown off by a bomb that should have killed him, but Michael had finished his mission first. He had crawled for 2 miles on his hands and stumps to complete his objective before he allowed himself to be rescued. Now he walked on artificial legs, and the coalition doctors could not understand how his body had adapted to them so quickly. More humans came, each one with their own story of survival. Each one proof that David Park was not unique. He was just the first example, but with curiosity came fear. And with fear came aggression. The Drekathi were a proud species. They had been the warriors of the coalition for 10,000 years. Their bodies were weapons covered in natural armor and equipped with strength that could crush stone. They believed they were the greatest fighters in the galaxy. The idea that soft, weak, vulnerable humans might be their equals was more than they could accept. High Commander Morvax called a meeting of the full coalition assembly. It was held in a chamber so large that David could barely see the far walls. Species from 1,000 different worlds filled the seats, rising up in tiers like a stadium. Each one watching, each one waiting. I have observed the humans, Morvax announced. His voice echoed through the chamber. Translated into 100 different languages, I have seen their tests and their demonstrations. I have seen one of them catch a plasma bolt in his bare hand. A murmur ran through the crowd. Everyone had heard the story by now, but hearing it from Morvax made it real. But tests are not proof. Morvax continued, demonstrations are not truth. The only way to know if a species is truly strong is through combat. He turned to look at the section where the humans sat, David and James and Hannah and Michael, and all the others who had come to represent their planet. I challenge humanity, Morvax declared, one of your kind against one of mine. No weapons, no armor, no technology, pure combat, strength against strength, will against will. The chamber erupted, voices shouting in languages that sounded like thunder and music and static. Thelvan was on his feet, his scales flashing through every color at once, trying to restore order. But David was not listening to the chaos. He was looking at Morvax, and he understood this was not about pride. It was about fear. The Drekathi had built their entire identity around being the strongest. If humans could match them, that identity would crumble, and a species without identity was a species without purpose. If your champion wins, Morvax continued, once the noise died down, humanity will be granted full membership in the coalition, equal status with all other species, and if your champion wins, David asked Morvax, showed his mandibles in what might have been a smile. Then, humanity will be classified as a subordinate species under Dracathi protection. Of course, protection, David repeated. He knew what that word really meant. Ownership. The humans gathered together in a small room off the main chamber Colonel Lee was pacing, his fighter pilot instincts making him restless. Dr. Park was running calculations on a small device, her eyes distant. Sergeant Cho sat perfectly still, his artificial legs humming quietly. Who fights? James asked. David started to volunteer. He had faced Morvax before he knew how the Dracathi moved, how they thought he could. I will fight. The voice came from the doorway. A woman stood there, tall and lean, with dark hair pulled back from a face that showed no fear. Lisa Park, David's sister. She had come aboard as a cultural attaché, a diplomat. Her job was supposed to be talking, not fighting. But David knew her history. She had trained in martial arts since she was 6. She had won Olympic medals. She had spent her whole life learning how to use an opponent's strength against them. Lisa, David started. I am the right choice, she said, walking into the room. Morvax is bigger than any of you, stronger than any of you. If you try to match his power, you will lose. She looked around at the other humans. But power is not everything. James shook his head. You want to fight that thing with martial arts? He is 8 feet tall. His armor can stop bullets. Lisa smiled. I have fought bigger, she had. The exhibition matches she had done against sumo wrestlers, against heavyweight boxers, against anyone who wanted to test themselves against technique instead of size. She had won most of them. But this is different. David said, this is not a sport. This is not a game. If you lose, then humanity becomes a subordinate species. Lisa finished. I know. She met her brother's eyes, and David saw the same thing there that he felt inside himself. That stubbornness, that refusal to accept defeat, that fire that had kept the Park family going through generations of hardship. I will not lose, she said. Morvax laughed when he saw her step forward in the assembly chamber. This is your champion, he demanded, pointing at Lisa. She's half the size of her brother. She has no scars, no marks of battle. She looks like prey, not predator. Lisa bowed, a gesture of respect that confused him. I do not need scars. The Dracathi commander leaned closer. What do you have, then, little human? What makes you think you can survive against? Melissa straightened up and met those dark insect eyes. Patience, she said. For just a moment, David saw something flicker across Morvax's face. Out. The arena was ancient. The coalition had used it for thousands of years to settle disputes that could not be resolved through words. The floor was made of something like stone, worn smooth by countless battles. The walls rose up in a perfect circle, lined with seats that held representatives from every species in the galaxy. Billions more watched through broadcasts that reached across the stars. This was not just a fight between two individuals. It was a statement about what humanity was and what humanity could become. Lisa Park stood in the center of the arena. She wore simple clothes, loose pants, and a fitted top that would not restrict her movement. Her feet were bare, feeling the texture of the floor beneath her. She had removed all jewelry, all distractions. There was nothing on her but skin and cloth and willowcross from her. Morvax waited. He had removed his ceremonial armor, showing the natural plates that covered his body, chitin that had evolved over millions of years to be harder than steel, muscles that could lift 10 times what the strongest human could manage, a body built for one purpose, destruction. I will try not to kill you, he said. The words echoed through the silent arena. But I make no promises. Lisa did not respond. She was breathing, slowly, feeling her heartbeat steady and calm. She had done this 1,000 times before, faced opponents who were bigger and stronger, and thought that size was everything. They had all learned the same lesson. The signal came. A flash of light from somewhere above, and Morvax charged. He was faster than something that large should be able to move. His feet cracked the stone floor as he launched himself forward, arms reaching to grab, to crush, to destroy. Lisa was not there. She moved to the side just slightly, using the momentum of her own preparation to slip past his grasping claws. Her hand touched his arm as he passed, not to strike but to feel, to understand how he moved, where his weight went, how his body worked. Morvax spun faster than she expected. His elbow came around like a club aimed at her head. Lisa ducked. She felt the wind of his strike pass over her hair, close enough to touch. She rolled with the motion coming up behind him, her breathing still calm, her heart still steady. The Dracathi turned, his eyes were narrowed now, the amusement was gone. "You are quick," he admitted, "but speed will not save you forever." He attacked again, a flurry of strikes that would have demolished stone walls. Each blow carried enough force to kill her instantly if it connected. But Lisa was not trying to stop the blows. She was reading them, learning their pattern, their rhythm, their weakness. Block a punch and your arm breaks, but redirect the punch and the attacker loses balance. Lisa did not fight Morvax. She flowed around him like water around stone, like wind around a mountain. She touched his arm and he stumbled. She shifted her weight and he overreached. She was always where he was not, always moving, always calm. Minutes passed. The arena was absolutely silent. Every species watching, holding their breath as they witnessed something impossible. A tiny human dancing with death and somehow surviving. Morvax was getting frustrated. His attacks became wilder, less controlled. He was used to enemies that stood and fought, that tried to match his strength. Those enemies always lost. But Lisa would not play that game. She would not give him a target. 5 minutes became 10, 10 became 15, and something began to change. Morvax was slowing. His breath came harder. His movements lost their precision. The Dracathi were built for explosive combat. Short, brutal encounters where their superior strength ended things quickly. They were not built for endurance, but Lisa was. She had run marathons. She had trained for hours without rest. She had meditated without moving for longer than most species stayed awake. She had prepared for exactly this moment her entire life. On the 20th minute, Morvax threw a punch that should have taken her head off, but it was slow. Slower than before, slow enough that Lisa did not just dodge. She redirected. Her hands caught his arm and turned his momentum against him. Her body twisted, using his own force to pull him off balance. Her foot swept his leg at exactly the right moment, and Morvax fell. The crash shook the arena. The greatest warrior of the Dracathi species lay on his back, staring up at the human who had put him there. His chest heaved. His limbs trembled. He tried to rise, but his body would not obey. Lisa stood over him, barely breathing hard. "Yield," she said. Morvax stared at her. His mandibles worked, but no sound came out. "Yield," Lisa repeated. She did not shout. Her voice was soft, almost kind. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, slowly, Morvax let his head fall back against the stone. "I yield." The silence shattered. A sound rose from the crowd. Not quite cheering, not quite anything that had been heard before. 1,000 different species trying to process what they had just witnessed. Lisa knelt beside the fallen warrior. She placed her hand on his armored shoulder, a gesture of respect. How Morvax rasped. How can something so soft be so strong? Lisa smiled, the first expression she had shown since the fight began. "Because we are Earthborn," she said. "We come from a world that tried to destroy us every day for 1,000,000 years. We did not survive by being the strongest or the fastest. We survived by being the most stubborn, the most adaptable, the most unwilling to die." She stood and turned to face the assembled coalition. All those strange creatures from strange worlds who had thought they understood what strength meant. "You wanted data," she said, and her voice carried across the arena, translated into every language known to the galaxy. "Here it is. Humans are not exceptional because of what we can do. We are exceptional because of what we refuse to accept." She raised her fist, the same gesture her brother had made when he crushed the plasma bolt. "We refuse to accept limits. We refuse to accept defeat." We refuse to accept that anything is impossible." Her voice rose, filling the arena, filling the broadcast, filling the space between stars. "We are Earthborn, and we are just getting started." The applause started small. A few humans clapping. Then the glass creatures joined in, their bodies chiming like bells. Then more species and more, until the sound became a wave that washed over everything. Thelvan watched from his seat. His scales had shifted to a color that no one had ever seen on a diplomat before, bright and warm, and somehow hopeful in the arena. Lisa helped Morvax to his feet. The Dracathi commander towered over her, but somehow in that moment she seemed like the larger one. "I was wrong," he said. "No," Lisa replied, "you were just looking at the wrong things." 3 years later, the Galactic Coalition voted unanimously to grant humanity full membership. Not as subordinates, not as curiosities, as equals. David Park became the first human ambassador. Lisa founded an academy that taught coalition species the human art of turning weakness into strength. Grace Kim led research teams that helped the galaxy understand what made Earth and its children so unique. But the most important change was invisible across 1,000 worlds. Species that had given up, species that had accepted their place in the cosmic order, began to whisper a new word: Earthborn. Not a species, a philosophy, a reminder that the universe was not a prison of impossibilities, but a challenge waiting to be overcome, and humanity had only just begun to show them how. Though stars had always seemed cold and distant, full of dangers that humans could not imagine. But now, as ships carrying human crews began to explore beyond the boundaries of coalition space, those stars did not seem so frightening. They were just another challenge, and humans have been overcoming challenges since the first of them looked up at the night sky and decided to reach for it. This was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning.